Hi,
Hi,
Dr. Swain.
how are you?
Very well. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
As we get started today, the first thing I want to do is give a big thank you to Julie Stewart and the Claire Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women for making today's class possible. The Claire Booth Luce Center, it's not easy to say, has worked with this class for many years and brought us all kinds of fantastic speakers with a conservative outlook, and that's what we're going to hear today. And of course, my class is all about providing different points of view. So we'll continue with that today. Let me give you a little introduction to Dr. Swain, and then I will have her speak more about her background. She taught politics and public policy at Princeton as an associate professor, and then went on and taught political science and law at Vanderbilt University from 1999 till 2017. Dr. Swain received her BA from Roanoke College in criminal justice, a master's in political science from Virginia Tech, another master's of legal studies from Yale Law School, and a PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina. Fair amount of time in school. She is the author of many books on topics ranging from white nationalism to immigration to race versus class. And most recently, Dr. Swain served as the co-chairwoman for President Trump's 1776 Commission. With that, thank you so much for joining us, and I turn it over to you, Dr. Swain.
Thank you so much, and welcome to all the students. I wish I could see you as I'm speaking, but unfortunately, I just have to imagine you.
The problems with webinars.
I know. Well, I would say that one of the most important degrees you didn't mention, and that was the community college degree in business that opened the door to the other degrees. And as far as my background, and I don't mind telling everyone my age because people tell me I don't look my age. I was born in 1954, and that was the year of the Brown versus Board of Education school decision, Supreme Court decision that desegregated schools across America. It took another 10 years before schools were desegregated in Virginia, where I was born and raised. And I was born and raised in the rural part of Virginia. I was one of 12. We lived in extreme poverty. I dropped out of school after completing the 8th grade. I got a high school equivalency, married at 16, had my first child at 17. And in my early 20s, I went to school to get a better job. Had no idea I would become a university professor. And people came into my life and they encouraged me. And when I started with my community college degree in business, I thought that I would work as a store manager. People encouraged me to continue my education, and one degree led to another. And before I knew it, I was in academia. It was not planned, not by me. And for most of my career, during the time I was at Princeton, I was a congressional scholar. And that was very important to me at the time because there were very few women who were recognized as congressional scholars. Linda Fowler would be one of the ones. She was like one of the female pioneers as a congressional scholar. But at that time, there were not very many. And I don't know, do students still read Dick Fenno's book, Homestyle? Okay. Well, that was an important book back in my day. So at any rate, academia, during the time I was in academia, I was a Democrat. In fact, I was a Democrat up until 2009. And as maybe I'm not going in the direction I should be going in here, but most of my career, I was, pretty much just focused on career, not so much about the politics that was surrounding me. And so I had my head down, very much focused on my discipline, did not spend a lot of time other than, just being aware of what was taking place in the world. I was not actively involved in politics in any kind of way. And I would say that later in my life, I became more interested in things that were happening. But the turning point for me was in the late 1990s. I had a Christian conversion experience, and that caused me to look at the world differently. So that happened 1999, and probably in 2000 or 2001, I started identifying as an independent. At 2008, I was appointed by President Bush to two political appointments. One was the Tennessee Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, and the other was for the National Endowment for the Humanities. I was appointed as an independent, and during the time I was on that commission, I found myself, surrounded by all kinds of people, but I started getting to know Republicans. And my posture at that time was I sort of stood in the middle and I threw rocks at both political parties. And I had many people advise me to take a side. They said you can't be in the middle, throwing rocks at both parties. And eventually, I guess I took a side because in 2009, I decided to become a Republican, not because I thought they were perfect, and I still don't think they're perfect. And I feel like there's no political solution, for a lot of what's affecting America. I'm very disillusioned with both political parties. And so that's a little bit about me and where I am. And as I look out at the American landscape today, I find myself dismayed because I feel like the America that I knew and loved, that it no longer exists. And I hear all this stuff about systemic racism, and I can say that I was born into a system of systemic racism. In 1954, when everything was segregated, that was systemic racism. When I was going to school and I was in segregated schools being bused 45 minutes from home, that was systemic racism. But I watched systemic racism crumble with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Open Housing Act. And those pieces of legislation created opportunities for people like me. And because I was hardworking, I always wanted to make the A. And I did not want to just squeak by in my classes. I always wanted to be at the very top. And that was something innate in me. And there was something in me too, that if someone said I couldn't do something, I was determined to show them that I could. And so that's a little bit about my background. And so today, I feel like in a lot of areas, we're moving backwards. And I'm pausing to give you an opportunity to ask me questions because I want to keep everything, in line with what you're talking about for your students.
Okay, if anyone has any questions so far but otherwise, if you want to talk about your work with the commission and go on, and then I think more questions will come in.
Well, the other thing that I would say in this past election, I think that there was a great loss of confidence in the democratic process, largely among Republicans. And I think that unless we can ensure people that there will be integrity at the polls and that we're going to take the Constitution seriously, election irregularities, voter verification, all of those things, if we cannot ensure people that they will be taken seriously, I think we're going to end up with a one-party system because many Republicans that I know are not going to volunteer, they're not going to go to the polls, they're not going to donate their money. And so if you want an America that's governed by one political party, I think we've reached the point where that could be the case. And I personally am hoping that this legislation that's before Congress, H.R. 1, that's called For the People, this voting rights bill, I'm hoping that it doesn't pass because what it would do would be to enshrine in law many of the things that took place in the past election that were unconstitutional, that overstepped the boundaries of the states when it came to the legislative laws that were on the books. I think it's a very dangerous piece of legislation. And I'm not encouraged by the Republican response that they're going to be successful unless it's maneuvering through the Senate, withholding that legislation at bay. And when I speak to you all as students, I want to speak to us as Americans because we all have a stake, I would say, in free speech. We have a stake in having a constitution. We have a stake in a two-party system and a democratic republic. But there may be people that think that we no longer need that we really do need to destroy America and rebuild it. And if that's how you feel, then I think, maybe you should be dancing in the streets, because I think you've made a lot of progress, people who would like to dismantle America in reaching that goal.
Okay, a few questions have come in. We'll start with these. Noah asks, I think he's saying, do you believe systemic racism still exists?
I believe that systemic racism against racial and ethnic minorities, members of, I would say that it does not exist the way it existed when I was a child. And I would say that there is reverse racism against white people that's taking place, and that the racism that we see coming from critical race theory, when they talk about white privilege, when they're shaming and bullying of white people and white children because of the color of their skin, I believe that it's a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and the civil rights laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and many civil rights laws that are on the books of state governments. And so there's systemic racism, but it's not taking the form that it took when I was a child. I see America as a land of tremendous opportunities, one that bends over backwards when there's a talented racial ethnic minorities. I believe that some of the problems that are affecting certain parts of the Black and Hispanic communities, it has to do with the culture and choices that people make, as well as what you internalize. Because I think that what you believe affects what you can accomplish. If you believe the world is stacked against you and that it doesn't matter what you do, then, like, why get out of bed? And for myself as a young person, I believed that if I worked hard, that I could attain the American dream. And that's what I believed. And that was a factor in my being willing to make sacrifices and to study and to work hard. And I didn't say this, but this is a fact that when I was at the community college, I was a work study student working 10 hours a week. Because I was responsible, a full-time job was created for me nights and weekends. I worked that full-time job nights and weekends in the library, and I went to school full-time. And I was able to do that for about 5 years while I finished my degree at the four-year college. I graduated magna cum laude, and that was because no one used the library nights and weekends. It was a great job. I could do my homework.
Okay, Laura asks, how do you think we can increase the integrity of future elections?
I would like to see us take seriously voter identification. And there's a narrative out there that asking for voter IDs discriminates against Black people are being used, but they're saying it discriminates against racial and ethnic minorities. I would argue that that's not true. There's no evidence for it. And that to just exist in this country and to do anything, you have to have an identification. It's not hard to get an identification. I see nothing wrong about expecting people to show some form of photo ID when they vote. And I think there should be consequences for voter fraud, because we do know that there are people that vote multiple times. And in this last election, because they had the mail-in ballots and absentee ballots, there were lots of opportunities for people, to register at multiple addresses and sometimes vote from more than one state. Nowadays, when people are caught doing that, I don't think the penalties are harsh enough to deter it as an action.
Okay, Graham asks, do you have any specific verified examples of voter fraud from the 2020 election? How do you
I,
rationalize your stance that the election was undemocratic against the countless independent commissions, inquiries, and officials, including Republicans, in every state that reported no substantial evidence of voter fraud in the election?
I'm not gonna, what I can say about that is I'm not sure where you're getting your evidence from, but there's plenty of documented sources of voter fraud in various states. And some people now have started to get indicted, but not enough in large numbers. I would be happy to send you information through your professor that he can share with the class. But it is a serious problem, and it's something that we should all have a stake in. And I don't believe in ballot harvesting. I'm from Virginia, and I have relatives that live in the projects, and they have reported, some of them reported getting multiple ballots and 3 and 4 people showing up at their doorstep, standing there demanding that people fill out the ballots. Now, these ballot harvesters, do you really think that if a person was bold enough to fill out a ballot for Donald Trump or some Republican, if they were bold enough to do that with people standing on their doorstep, 2 or 3 people, and they handed that ballot over to these ballot harvesters, do you really think that the ballot would get turned in? And one of the things that happened in this last election that, is untested, and there are lawsuits that have been filed about it, was that millions of dollars were donated to put drop boxes in certain communities. Zuckerberg donated millions of dollars to do that. And so the ballot boxes were put in the inner city, various places. They were not put in Republican areas. And some state and city officials were involved in this because they received grants. Workers were hired from the grant money. That is new, untested territory to have private actors involved in elections.
Okay, a lot of questions coming in now. So let's see. Where's the next one? Noah asks if you'll talk about your experience on the 1776 council.
Okay, it was a very short experience. The commission, the president did the executive order, I believe, November 2nd, but it was after the election that we met. And we met for the first time December 18th, and that was when it was announced. And then on January 4th, that was the first meeting of the commission. But we knew that we were at risk of being dismantled. And so our goal was to get out a report as quickly as possible. And so we worked very hard to get that done, and we were able to accomplish that. Our report was released on January 18th. And it was a short report. It's been published now as a book. And during the president's first day of office, the day he was inaugurated, he issued an executive order abolishing our commission. And I was hoping that it wouldn't get abolished. I thought it was a great opportunity for us to have a bipartisan group of scholars working on the commission that was to, celebrate the 1776 anniversary, and to look at ways to teach America's founding to school children. And so that's something, again, I think that we all should have a stake in. I don't see why the commission had to be eliminated. President Biden could have added his own people to the commission.
Any highlights from the report you care to mention?
Well, I think that the most important, the commission itself was a reaction to the 1619 project that the New York Times unveiled in 2019. And the 1619 report, pretty much says America was founded as a racist country. It was racist to the core. And it even talks about 1619 as if it was the founding date of the United States. And we know that America was a British colony. The 1619 report also implied that the Revolutionary War was fought over slavery. You know, there's no evidence of that being the case. And what we were trying to do was to show people the importance of the Declaration of Independence, those words. And we know that the drafters were imperfect people. We're all imperfect people, but they drafted a document that has stood the test of time. And if you look at Frederick Douglass and many of the Black leaders of the past, they took the Declaration of Independence very seriously, and it played a key role in the fight for civil rights. And if you look at the Constitution, another document that people like to pick apart today, our Constitution allowed us, you know, to have the framework that resulted in the elimination of not just slavery, but also it enfranchised women, and the progress we got through 2 world wars. The tremendous progress we've made in this nation had a lot to do with those founding documents. And I think it's very important for students to read those documents, not commentaries about them, not Howard Zinn's history of, you know, the American people, but read the documents for yourself and draw your own conclusions. And I don't believe that the thinkers we have today could have drafted better documents than the ones that were drafted as the Declaration of Independence and as the Constitution. And so pretty much we were encouraging people to go back to those documents and teach civic education. And we believe that our nation is stronger if people, especially young people, understand more about the founding. And, you know, slavery happened. It was a horrible thing. But at the same time, we have made tremendous progress in this country. And when I look at America, I see a nation that's always trying to be better, that whenever its flaws are pointed out, it has always tried to improve. And we're at a point now where we seem to be erasing history. And I don't agree with turn down monuments. I think we need to keep the monuments. We need to learn from history, and we don't advance if we are constantly trying to tear down the reminders of the past. I think the past is there for us to learn from.
Right. Emily asks about your response to the January 6th storming of the Capitol.
Well, I can tell you, I was in DC on January 4th. I left on January 5th, and that was on purpose. Okay. I'm not a rally kind of girl. I've spoken at a couple, but that's not my cup of tea. And I assumed that Antifa and Black Lives Matter would be there because whenever Republicans gather, they always show up. That was one thing. The other thing was I look forward to standing out in the cold, you know, for an hour or 2 hours waiting on a rally. And so I was not there on purpose. I watched it on TV like the rest of
seeing it. What was your reaction to what you saw?
I was, for one thing, I knew a lot of the people that actually went to the rally, and I had been invited to go and stuff like that. I knew that there had to be more to the story than what I was actually seeing. And there have been, you know, reports now, and I know many of your students may not have heard, you know, the later reports about what happened, because, you know, the first narrative was that a Trump supporter had hit Brian Sicknick, the police officer, over the head with a fire extinguisher, and it resulted in his death. And now we know that it looks, no one hit this police officer. His family says he had a stroke. And they talked about, you know, this big insurrection. What happened, you know, was a protest that got out of hand, but most of the people that were there were not the protesters at the rally. The 800 and some thousand people, most of those people were not at the Capitol. So that's one thing. But I think that what I believe is that it shows how a narrative can get out of control. And so we heard that there was this terrible insurrection, that 5 people died. Well, 3 of those people died of medical emergencies. And I don't know, like if you have 8 or 900,000 people in a crowd outside in the winter, and a lot of these people are elderly, how many people die anyway? How many people die anytime you have a large group? I don't know, but I know that they had the death count at 5, and part of the narrative was that a police officer had been killed, and that narrative has been quietly retracted. And then there were 2 police officers that were Capitol Hill policemen, and for some reason they committed suicide. I don't know why they committed suicide, but I think that if you follow the story, not just what we heard in the news immediately after the event took place, you get a very different picture of the series of events. And then there were some intelligence reports that they were warned that Nancy Pelosi and the mayor of DC were warned that there were some bad actors coming to DC. And there were reports of people that had gas masks, climbing gear, and just they were ready for a riot. They came equipped for a riot. These were not people that came to hear Donald Trump. These were people that came to do what happened. And so I would say that it was very complicated, and don't believe, you know, the first reports and the first narratives, and that's even about police shootings. Whatever you hear first, those first reports when the media is going nonstop, if you stick with the story, a couple of weeks later, maybe it'll be a month later, it'll be a very different story.
Okay. Jose would like to know, in response to voter ID laws, do you think we should make it easier to access an ID, like make them free, so long as they're not stolen or lost before they expire? So
I wouldn't have a problem with that. I think they are free for elderly people in some states. I know in Tennessee, I believe it is. And people that own welfare and public assistance, I think that I've never heard of there being a problem with people getting IDs. They have to have IDs to get public assistance. People that are getting public assistance have IDs.
Okay. Raisa asks, what role do you think Trump should have in the GOP and American politics, I guess, going forward?
Here's how I feel. I feel a lot of things. One is Republicans don't understand politics as well as Democrats. And I'm not willing to concede that Democrats are smarter than Republicans, but I'm asking the question. They seem to be shrewder than Republicans. And Donald Trump, after having been a Democrat all of his life, he's the only one that actually seems to understand how to street fight. And so I think Donald Trump should have whatever role he wants to have. But I think that if the Republican Party is going to survive, that some of its leaders need to rethink their posture. I just think that Republicans are doomed because they get outmaneuvered all the time.
Can you give an example of what you mean?
I mean, even I would say that when the Capitol Hill riot took place, and I'm gonna call it a riot, when that took place, there were some Republicans that just immediately jumped on the media narrative, and they started apologizing, and they started calling Trump names, and they started making statements that they didn't have the information to know what was true or what was not true. To me, that's not very smart. And I think it's very destructive for the party. And that happens more often than not. And I think that Democrats stick together and Republicans don't. They eat their own. And I'm not sure why that's the case. It could be because, you know, we're big into individualism. And so maybe it's the individualism thing that's the trap for Republicans. But they don't seem to be as effective as they could be if they were as organized as Democrats. I think they could learn a lot from the Democratic Party.
Okay, Abby and Noah both are asking something similar. I'll read Noah's. Many Republicans chose not to vote by mail. Many Democrats did as they were encouraged to. do you think if the Republican Party had embraced vote by mail, Trump would have won? And Abby asks, do you believe if there was no voter fraud, Trump would have won the election? So,
Well, I would say that Republicans did not trust the mail process, the mail-in process, and I think for good reason. I think it was very flawed, and it's something that the Democrats had wanted for years. And what I find very troubling, one of the things about this election is that how COVID has been used to just totally restructure America. There has been a great reset, and so things that would never ever have happened before COVID was used as the excuse, for the mail-in ballots and for just relaxing of the rules. I think that I believe voter fraud took place. I think it was massive, and I think it took many different forms. And I am one of the people that believe that if you had a fair count of the election without the voter fraud, and if we were allowed to actually investigate, because this was strange, that if you talked about voter fraud, if you said the election was stolen, you lost your Twitter account or your Facebook account. People got shut out and shut down just for saying that. And that is totally un-American. And if there was nothing to see, why would big tech and all of these forces come together to shut down all conversation about the election? And that was the way it was up until the inauguration. And then everything started to relax. And I did not get any of my accounts shut down until after the election. Maybe about 3 weeks ago, I shared the Mike Lindell video where he had hired these investigators and he did a special report on the election. I shared it on LinkedIn of all places, and my account was suspended, and I appealed, and they responded to me that they would get back to me in 14 days. And I responded that if my account was not up in 24 hours, that I was going to go public, and they got my account back up on the 25th hour. But it was because I had shared information about Mike Lindell's special, and I had also asked people were they following what was taking place in the States regarding the election.
Okay. Alex wants to know, what are some reliable news sources that you would recommend students take a look at?
Something, when I was a Democrat, during the time I was a professor and I was teaching, I would have told students, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Economist, Wall Street Journal, all of these places all these media sources were considered, legitimate. But in today's environment, there's no way that you can read any one of those newspapers and get a good sense of what's taking place in America. So I think that if you want to be totally informed, you have to go to conservative as well as liberal media sources, some international media sources, and you have to be willing to put it all together, because each media outlet, if it's a more conservative one, they're going to be focused on the information that they're focused on the election. They're presenting more of the studies. Mike Lindell was able to have his report aired on One America News. He paid to have that done. He spent millions of dollars putting together that special. And so I'm not going to say that there is any by itself that I would trust, but there was a time when either the news media changed and became less reliable, or I'm just not sure. But all I know is that I take my media sources, I get my information from a lot of different sources, and I feel like you have to put it all together, and then you have to use your common sense. And if you think about the election, the population in America of the American population, I guess is 330 million people or something, roughly that many. how many are registered voters. And if Joe Biden got 80 million votes and Trump got 74 million, does that exceed the number of registered voters in the United States? And if it does exceed the number of registered voters in the United States, then where did all those other people come from? And I think that we are going to be finding out what happened in this past election over a period of months and years. And what I discovered was that we don't have a mechanism for dealing with voter fraud and stolen elections at the national level. And that when it was suspected in the past, it was just understood that if your party lost, that you just go along with it and you would give your concession speech and you'd go away quietly. And then months later, the information would come out about how a particular election was stolen. Well, Donald Trump didn't play by the rules, and he never plays by the rules, and that's why I like him.
Okay, that ties into the next question. A different Alex says, thank you for coming to speak to us. I saw your on Twitter, you posted, President Trump is so wise. We need leaders like him who can speak truth and see through the schemes of America's enemies. But then Alex wants to know, do you believe Trump was speaking the truth when he referred to Mexican immigrants as rapists, thugs, and drug dealers, or calling African nations names? And do you consider these wise and truthful remarks?
Well, that's a Alex that asked that question.
Another Alex, yes.
Well, that's a good question, Alex. And I would say that among the people that come across the border, there's certainly rapists and child molesters and coyotes, not the kind that are animal coyotes, but people that prey on other people, and human trafficking. And so he may have spoken in broad ways, but when you have an open border like we have right now under Joe Biden, all kinds of horrible things are coming across the border. And as far as African nations, there are some African nations where we still have slavery. And I think that when Donald Trump says something, there's a lot of grains of truth in it. And with stereotypes have grains of truth in them. And so Trump may be crude and blunt, but I think there's a lot of truth in the things that he said. And when he told us that he was spied on as a candidate, if you look back to look back to when President Trump was first elected in 2016 and 2017, many of the things that he told us and he warned us about, you may not have gotten it in your news, but he was totally spot on and it was vindicated, but you may not have heard about it. And so I think that if history does a fair job of assessing Donald Trump, that he will be rated very highly among presidents. And I applaud him for what he tried to do for America. I believe in national sovereignty. And I believe that one reason that America has been the envy of the world is that we have been able to do so much for other nations. But if you change America in a way where we are all equally poor, then that does not enable America to help countries that are less well off. And there's no reason for us to believe that our poverty is going to somehow enrich those nations.
Okay, Maria asks, if you weren't initially involved in politics, why did you pursue your specific degrees, and how have they informed your work up till now?
Well, I can tell you why I studied political science. I mean, I can tell you why I got every degree.
Okay.
When I started college, I wanted to do art, but the counselor told me to be practical. And so I did business instead. And so that was, a bit of a struggle. I thought I was going to be a store manager and I was going to manage a store at the mall. And so that was the first degree. When I applied for jobs to get my position as the store manager, I was told I needed a 4-year degree. At that time, I went through the college catalog and I looked for the field that had the least amount of math, and I landed on criminal justice. And I knew I would do well with criminal justice and the social sciences because I knew what my strengths were. And so that's how I picked criminal justice. When I chose political science, I had become fascinated with power relationships. And coming from the kind of poverty I came from, I didn't have any personal power, but I wanted to study other people who had it. And so that's how I got to political science. And I never anticipated becoming a university professor. In fact, I had a crippling shyness up until I was in my 40s. And that shyness did not disappear until I had my Christian conversion experience. And it was almost like instantly, it was gone. And I started talking, and I've never shut up.
Okay. Clay asks, do you believe that the lack of overall voter turnout is a threat to the integrity of the system? If so, are you open to measures to increase this, as are used in other countries, such as fines, a voting day, making voting day a national holiday, online voting?
I don't think that we need all of that, and I don't think anyone should be forced to vote, and I don't believe that people should be knocking on your door, 3 or 4 people demanding that you fill out a ballot. I think that's un-American. And I think that not voting is a choice, because if you don't vote, then that's a vote for the status quo. And so I would not be in favor of that. And this whole idea, the stimulus bill that was just passed, it mails checks to people who are in prison. And the question is how they're going to stimulate the economy. And if they're in prison, aren't we already giving them room and board? And to me, a lot of the things that are being done in the name sometimes of social justice does not make a lot of sense for the rest of our society. And when it comes to making voting easier, are you going to force people to vote? Are you going to pay them to vote? There are things that are taking place in America that should not be taking place.
Shannon asks, what are your thoughts on the Black Lives Matter movement?
I got into a lot of trouble in 2016. And I may have been the first university professor ever to be canceled. And I say that, but I took early retirement from my university. My university did not try to strip me of my tenure or anything like that, but I was becoming too controversial on a lot of things. And one of the things I did, I gave a CNN interview, and I think it was July 2016. It was right after the 5 Dallas police officers were slain, and that was right after a Black Lives Matter rally. And to prepare for the interview and my debate with Areva Martin, I believe that's her name. She's a lawyer from LA. I believe her name was Areva Martin. I went to the Black Lives Matter website, and what I saw was language that I felt like, gee, this isn't communism, this is Marxism. And so I said during that interview that they were Marxists, and I thought they were, that they had a destructive agenda for America. And I urged the viewers to go to that website. And that was like, before then on campus, there were certain groups that didn't like, what I had to say, but I solidified all the marginal groups, I guess, because at that point I had offended some of the Blacks on campus. They were loyal until I criticized Black Lives Matter. And I think that what we do is that we confuse the slogan. Black Lives Matter is a slogan just like this whole thing about for the people, for the people. It just sounds wonderful. Of course, Black Lives Matter. And I'm a person who says that white lives matter, all lives matter. And social justice warriors would say that's hate speech, but I believe that all lives are precious. And so people that confuse the Black Lives Matter slogan with the organization, I think that they are making a huge mistake, and that the activists are taking advantage of people who do care about all lives, and they're forcing them to agree to things that are not in their interest, not in the interest of the nation, because they don't want to seem like they're not supportive of Black lives. Giving money to Black Lives Organization, supporting their agenda, and marching with them does nothing for Black people. And so if you out there, think about it, there's a slogan of Black Lives Matter. And that's a true statement, but there's also an organization that stands for a lot of things that Americans wouldn't agree with.
Okay. Laura asks, can you speak a little about your book, Abduction, How Liberalism Steals Our Children's Hearts and Minds?
Well, thank you for asking. That was a book that I co-authored with a pastor, and we both had experienced situations as Christians where there were young people that had been raised in the church, traditional families. They went off to college, and by Thanksgiving, they were questioning their faith and everything they had believed. And as a university professor, I have watched what takes place during orientation week. And I have seen the pressure on students. Like, universities have their own sets of principles and norms. And so they are molding a particular kind of person. And some of them have a clear agenda to break down and erase whatever that young person brings from home. And so it's like a culture shock. And the purpose of that book was to educate parents and grandparents and people about what's taking place, not just at colleges and universities, but also at secondary schools. And it didn't just look at schools; it also looked at literature, books, videos, various things in our culture that were seducing children in a way and pulling them away from the values and principles that we have traditionally thought were important in America. And the sexualization of our children, and you see that, in the clothes that are being sold, young children as young as even 4 or 5 to sexualize children, but also the field trips and things that are taking place in the sex ed curriculum, where you're not just teaching, the old-fashioned, birds and bees or whatever, but it's become almost like a how-to manual, even aimed at kids as young as 4 or 5. And I think a lot of other people, and I hope some of your parents wouldn't think it would be appropriate to expose young children 4 and 5 to sex education material that would cause them to question if they were really a little girl or little boy. I think that's very problematic. And I think adolescence is hard enough that we're doing some very dangerous things with our children. And I believe as a consequence, and the book doesn't say this, but we see the suicide rate of children increasing. It's increasing dramatically. And I think there's so much pressure on kids and so many things that they have to deal with that it's certainly when my children were young, and even with my grandchildren, I don't think they have had it to the same extent as young people are getting it today.
Okay, let's see, from Carla. If there was evidence of valid voter fraud, why do you believe the U.S. Supreme Court, although they are to be apolitical, rejected Trump's election appeals?
I think that Trump made a mistake. For one thing, I love President Trump, but he talks too much. He kept saying, well, I might have to take this to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, I think he put pressure on the conservatives at the Supreme Court. They didn't want to deal with the issues. There were clear constitutional matters that they should have settled. They didn't want to deal with that. And then there's a lot of fear. There are people that the political left does not give up. I mean, they'll be at your doorstep. They'll be knocking on your door. They're, in some cases, breaking out your windows. And I think that people are cowards. But the Supreme Court did take one case that will have implications for ballot harvesting, depending on how they rule. And so that may turn out to be the more important case. And as far as the other irregularities that took place in the election, that could be dealt with at the state level. And if Republicans knew what they were doing all across the country, they would be working with the state legislatures, because as it stands under the Constitution, the states are responsible for the elections. And some of the irregularities that took place had to do with attorney generals or governors that overstepped the legislature and violated not just the US Constitution in some cases, but the state constitutions. And that was something that the Supreme Court didn't address.
And speaking of the Supreme Court, Bradley asks, can you elaborate on the unconstitutional aspects of HR 1 that you were talking about?
Well, HR 1 there are lots of things that it's trying to do, but it's trying to federalize elections, because under the Constitution now, the states deal with elections. They would like to set up commissions where instead of the state legislatures drawing the district lines after the census, every 10 years there's a census, and then the district lines are drawn. Whichever political party has control of the state legislature or the state, then they get to draw the district lines. That's the way it's always been. It so happens that there are more Republican state legislatures than there are Democrats. Republicans control more. And so with this bill, they're trying to take it out of the hands of the states and give it to the federal government. That is a loss of power for the states. It's a loss of power for the 10th Amendment. So that's one thing. They're also exploring lowering the voting age to 16. And I was married at 16, but I don't think many of you all would have, think about 16. Are you really prepared to make voting decisions at 16? And if you are, then maybe you should drink at 16, and maybe you should go to war at 16.
Okay. Unfortunately, it's already 5 o'clock, so the class I have to call here